This week, we'll take a break from the civilizations of the Western tradition to look briefly at East Asia, especially the emergence of a recognizable Chinese empire. Your textbook has several different chapters devoted to East and Southeast Asia, but unfortunately our schedule doesn't allow us the time to look at more than one. Briefly, civilization emerged in China, especially the northern Chinese Huanghe River Valley, near the end of the 3rd millennium BC. Chinese historical traditions tell of 3 successive dynasties ruling much of northern China through the 2nd and early 1st millennia, the Xia, Shang, and Zhou. Shang period China, from circa 1900 to 1046 BC, encompasses much of Bronze Age Chinese history and marks the appearance of archaeologically verifiable states, writing, Chinese artistic traditions, and so on. Its last capital at Anyang is one of the richest royal burial places ever excavated by scientific archaeologists. Nevertheless, the Shang state ruled relatively little of what later came to be called China, as did its successor state Zhou in the 1st millennium BC. Zhou's rulers lost much of their influence and authority over time, but they retained nominal sovereignty over much of the northern Chinese heartland. During this long period of the Chinese Bronze Age, Chinese civilization took a markedly different path than the Western civilizations we've been examining. There were no true cities in China during the Bronze Age, though there were clear states. In China, royal administrative compounds formed the core of what have been called urban clusters, large, scattered arrangements of palaces, temples, and artisans' workshops located relatively nearby one another, but without large resident populations of commoners. The population densities of these clusters were low enough that, had the few residents desired to do so, they could have fed themselves. But since most of the residents of the urban clusters were bureaucrats or craftspeople, they did not farm, but rather imported food from nearby farming villages. Thus, these Bronze Age urban clusters in China fall in between the concepts of village and city that we've discussed in the West. This serves as an illustration that human civilization doesn't necessarily play nice, following the somewhat arbitrary patterns that archaeologists use to make sense of the past. There are intermediary and difficult to classify circumstances. True cities don't appear in China until the Eastern Zhou period. This begins in 770 BC, when the Zhou kings, robbed of most of their real political power by local lords, relocated their capital to Luoyang. Following this move, the de facto independent kingdoms they ruled began developing true cities rapidly. By the 5th century BC, some were no doubt among the largest and most densely packed urban settlements in the world. Yanshadu may have housed as many as 316,000 people, though this is probably an inflated figure. What is certain is that the city was geographically huge, covering 20 square kilometers. Nothing in the Near East could rival that. One of the driving forces behind this rapid urbanization was technological development, especially the adoption of iron smelting and casting. Iron was increasingly in use throughout China in the Eastern Zhou period, and by 500 BC it was widespread. Chinese ironworkers invented an entirely different technique for working iron from the Near Eastern civilizations several centuries earlier, however. Whereas Near Eastern ironworkers heated the iron to red hot and hammered it into shape, a process called forging, Chinese ironworkers melted the iron to liquid and poured it into ceramic molds, a process called casting. Cast iron is cheaper than bronze, more plentiful, and more quickly produced than forged iron. Iron quickly became the standard metal used for everyday tools in China. Around the same time as the spread of iron tools, Chinese kings also began minting coins. A similar development happened at roughly the same time in Lydia, an important Iron Age kingdom in Anatolia, but Chinese coinage served a different purpose. Near Eastern coins were originally struck, that is hammered, in gold and silver, and were intended for use in rare, extremely high-value transactions. Only several generations later did more utilitarian coins of copper and bronze appear for everyday transactions. The earliest Chinese coins were cast in bronze and intended for daily use by the general populace. The reason for this difference may lie in the extremely large urban centers found in China. Coinage makes commerce much easier. Without money, marketplace bartering is very difficult. You must locate someone who both has what you want and wants what you have. Since everyone can use money, it's easier to strike a deal. Since such huge populations were living in Chinese cities, the smooth and efficient functioning of the marketplace was paramount. Otherwise, there'd be widespread famine. Thus, utilitarian coinage became more important more quickly. In the Near East, whose cities were relatively smaller, the adoption of coins came later. The latter half of the Eastern Zhou period, from 480 to 221 BC, is known as the Warring States period, because it marks a complete breakdown of the Zhou king's authority. Most of China descended into a centuries-long period of political chaos. 22 different states, each with its own king, capital, and army, fought for supremacy, with warfare basically constant for 250 years. This fighting was made possible by a massive expansion of the sizes of armies, which now numbered into the hundreds of thousands for the larger kingdoms, and the introduction of new weapons technology like iron weapons and the crossbow. With these new technologies widespread throughout China, no one state could gain the upper hand over the others. Which is not to say that these states were all uniformly trying to destroy one another. The Warring States period constitutes another interaction sphere, where evenly matched polities both compete and cooperate with one another, sharing ideas and growing culturally more similar. One example of the growing similarities among the warring states can be seen along the northern boundary of China, where states each independently began building rammed earth walls to guard against invasion from northern nomadic tribes. When neighboring states were cooperating with one another, these walls might be joined together. They'd later be joined across the entire northern frontier to form the Great Wall of China. By the beginning of the 3rd century BC, the wars among the 22 warring states had resulted in the conquest and absorption of most of them. Only 7 states remained: Qin, Qi, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yan, and Chu. An 8th state, the tiny Zhou state that still nominally held sovereignty, also remained. This is the stage on which China itself would finally appear. In 221 BC, the king of Qin, Yingzheng, finally succeeded in conquering the other warring states. Now firmly in control of the entirety of China, he renamed himself Qin Shihuangdi, the first emperor of China. Shihuangdi would die in 210 BC, and his empire would fall in a civil war in 206 BC. But his reforms put an end to the Warring States period and set the course for the next 2,000 years of Chinese history. This is the beginning of classic China, the Chinese Empire in the proper sense. One of the most important reforms that Shihuangdi instituted was a complete overhaul of how Chinese states were organized. Previous kingdoms, upon conquering new territory, had allowed the local nobility to remain in power as tributary kingdoms, a kind of arrangement similar to Egyptian imperial policy in the Near East and medieval European feudalism. Shihuangdi removed all of the local nobility, replacing them with bureaucrats whom he appointed, who would obviously be more loyal to the empire than to the local populations. He also largely did away with pre-existing boundaries between kingdoms and sliced up his empire into commanderies, administrative districts of roughly equal size and population, but which also cross-cut old ethnic and political boundaries. Once such a system was in place, old rivals were largely incapable of building up enough support to rebel. The first emperor also promoted a unified empire by building an extensive road network throughout the realm, with all the major roads converging at his capital at Xianyang. The longest road of this network was 7,500 kilometers long. The network allowed fast, efficient communication throughout the empire and promoted trade and interdependence between formerly independent communities. Another project was the joining of the various northern frontier walls into a single Great Wall of China. Though the wall at this point in time was not so visually stunning as later efforts, it ultimately reached 4,000 kilometers from Korea to the Ordos Desert and prevented invasions from the north for centuries. Shihuangdi's last major program to consolidate power in China was perhaps the most unfortunate for modern scholars. The tradition of literacy was 2,000 years old in China by his day, and for much of that time there had been a tradition of historical record-keeping. Shihuangdi ordered all of these historical records destroyed, except for those directly related to his own kingdom of Qin. He also burned all books that addressed politics at all. The intent here was very similar to the government in Orwell's novel 1984. By controlling history and only allowing people to learn the ideas the government itself approved of, Shihuangdi hoped to make it impossible for his people to rebel. It wasn't a public works project like the roads network or a political strategy like the control of history, but Shihuangdi's own tomb was undoubtedly one of the largest undertakings of his short rule as emperor. It lies outside the capital city of Shenyang, a burial mound standing 50 meters tall, surrounded by walls encompassing 2 square kilometers. Beneath the mound was constructed a replica of the emperor's palace. Tradition holds that the tomb held rivers of flowing mercury, great machines that recreated the movements of heavenly bodies, and sophisticated death traps to deter intruders. Supposedly, Shihuangdi's son and successor had all the workmen killed to maintain the secrets of the tomb. Probably the most amazing aspect of the tomb complex, however, is the one that never made it into the historical tradition. In 1974, farmers digging in fields outside the burial complex stumbled across the first of 4 great pits. These proved to hold an entire army of ceramic statues, today called the Terracotta Army. It consists of more than 8,000 life-sized human statues, 140 chariots, 520 horses, and 150 heavy cavalry horses. Each is produced in great detail, with most of the human soldiers having unique facial features, suggesting they were modeled from real individuals. The Terracotta Army is probably a representation of the emperor's personal guard, reproduced by imperial artists who continue to protect him in the afterlife. That the emperor could command the construction of not only a massive tomb complex, but also an entire army to defend it, speaks to the total control he held over China. Shihuangdi died in 210 BC, and Chinese traditions record him as a tyrannical and paranoid despot. It's not surprising that his dynasty did not last but a few more years. In 206 BC, a rebellion sacked Shenyang, and the Han Dynasty took power. It was the Han Dynasty that really consolidated and then expanded the Chinese Empire. The single dynasty ruled for more than 400 years, from 206 BC to AD 220. Han emperors and nobles continued the extravagant traditions of Shihuangdi, with elaborate tombs filled with massive displays of wealth. The most famous of which are the Jade burial suits, made up of thousands of tiny jade plaques, painstakingly sewn together with gold thread. They also continued the public works projects begun by their Qin predecessors, improving road networks and strengthening the borders of the empire. Urbanization continued to expand throughout much of China, driven by a population boom brought on by peace and stability. In AD 8, a census of the empire showed it to have 59,594,978 subjects, comparable to, but probably slightly more than, the contemporary Roman Empire. The Han capital was at Changan, just across the Wei River from Shenyang, and it quickly eclipsed the earlier capital. Around the same time as the census, Changan had a population of about 250,000 and had walls enclosing 46 square kilometers. Its walls were 16 meters thick at the base and rose 12 meters high. Records indicate that it took 60,000 soldiers to carry enough grain into the city to feed its population. The Han Dynasty maintained power in part by maintaining control over the economy. They took various essential industries into imperial control, creating government monopolies that kept the population dependent on their leaders. These monopolies included iron and salt mining, as well as the minting of coins. The Han were also shrewd enough to know that, were the common folk invested in their own government, they were less likely to rebel. They accomplished this by allowing local, non-noble families to enter the imperial bureaucracy and advance upward in government. They instituted the Chinese tradition of civil service exams not long after coming to power. These allowed any Chinese subject capable of passing the exams to enter government service. A growing body of educated, middle-class bureaucrats grew up throughout the empire, providing the emperors with a huge pool from which to draw their advisors and managers. This also worked to stop the local nobility in the various provinces from accumulating experienced officers loyal to themselves. Such civil service exams continue to be a feature of Chinese governments even today, and have been adopted in many other places, including the US. The Han Dynasty is the period during which the Chinese Empire began to interact most intensely with neighboring cultures outside of China proper. Han emperors campaigned in southern China and Southeast Asia to expand their domains, as well as northeast to Korea and into Central Asia. But the most important cultural contexts were peaceful trade connections created by the Silk Road. The Silk Road is the name given by modern scholars to the long network of trade routes that stretched westward from western China across Central Asia to the Near East. These routes had always existed, but became well established during the Han Dynasty. Chinese-produced silk would be traded first from the Han heartland in northern China to trading posts in the northwest of the empire, then would be passed from hand to hand until reaching the Roman Empire in the west. Meanwhile, Roman and Near Eastern luxuries would pass eastward, including glasswork and fine jewelry. Ideas and cultural practices were also traded along the Silk Road, with Buddhism entering China from India along this route. The great medieval Chinese novel Journey to the West describes, well, among much else, a journey along the Silk Road to India. Both the novel itself and the quasi-historical events it relates date much later than the Han Dynasty, however. The Han Dynasty, like all ancient empires, eventually fell. Having lasted 400 years, it was much more successful than many Near Eastern empires, but eventually internal conflicts weakened the emperor's authority and strengthened regional nobles. Finally, in AD 208, the Battle of Red Cliffs effectively broke the empire into 3 smaller kingdoms, and in AD 220, the last Han emperor was deposed. These events form the basis of the medieval novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Historically, the end of the Han Dynasty marks the beginning of the Three Kingdoms period, from AD 220 to 280, followed by more fragmentation. Centralized government would not be restored for several centuries in China. During the long Han Dynasty, however, the Chinese expansion throughout East Asia had had profound effects on neighboring cultures. The most significant developments were in the northeast and east, in Korea and Japan. These regions had been populated by small chiefdoms or minor states for many centuries, but under the influence of their behemoth neighbor, they quickly grew much more sophisticated. Following the collapse of Han rule in China, Korean and Japanese leaders quickly established their own kingdoms. These civilizations are thus secondary to the primary Chinese civilization. Parts of Korea had been under Han rule for centuries, and following the end of the Han Dynasty, the peninsula soon became divided between 3 rival kingdoms, Goguryeo, Silla, and Baekje. These kingdoms fought among themselves until, in AD 668, Silla succeeded in conquering the whole of Korea, creating the first unified Korean state. Along with statehood, Korean communities also adopted many trappings of Chinese culture, Chinese writing and Buddhism being the most important. Later, the Chinese philosophy of Confucianism would also be widely adopted in Korea. Japan is an island nation, therefore more isolated from Chinese influence. It was not completely outside of China's sphere, however, and as early as the 1st century AD we have records of Japanese envoys in the Chinese court. Later Japanese traditions list Japanese emperors going back to the 7th century BC. But the first archaeologically visible Japanese kingdom arose at Yamato in southern Japan around AD 250. This is the beginning of the Kofun period, from AD 250 to 650. during which states became established in much of southern Japan, and early emperors built their distinctive keyhole tombs. As in Korea, Yamato rulers adopted Chinese script for writing and Buddhist religion, though native Japanese Shinto traditions remained very important. Both Korean and Japanese kingdoms would go on to become major powers in East Asia, but they never rivaled the power and influence wielded by a unified China. They would both remain secondary until the 20th century, when Japan invaded China during World War II and briefly became the dominant power. Of course, that's beyond the scope of this class, so we'll stop here.